leave his country, to flee across the border.
People arrive at Iran's border with Armenia.
I took a bus to the border.
3 weeks into the 2026 Iran war, the displacement picture unfolding across Iran and along its borders represents one of the most consequential humanitarian and geopolitical pressure points of the entire conflict. Right now, the critical question is not just how many people are moving, but whether the current pattern of controlled internal displacement is about to shift into something neither Tehran's weakened institutions nor its neighbors are prepared to manage. The conflict began on February 28, 2026, when the United States and Israel launched coordinated strikes on multiple sites across Iran. The strikes killed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and numerous senior officials, with hits recorded in Tehran's Pasteur Street district near the Presidential Palace and the National Security Council. The speed and scale of that opening was unprecedented. Within hours, Iran had lost not just military infrastructure, but the central nervous system of its governing structure. And in a city of 10 million people, that kind of sudden rupture sends a signal that no official statement can fully contain. What followed in Tehran was immediate and visible. The city's bustling downtown began to empty, with shops closed and the historic Grand Bazaar shuttered, something that had not occurred since the peak of the COVID-19 pandemic. Traffic jams stretched for kilometers on roads leading out of the city, with many heading toward the Caspian Sea region, and long lines formed at gas stations as residents scrambled for fuel, with limits set at 25 liters per car. That image alone tells you something important. When people start rationing fuel to flee, the calculation has already shifted from discomfort to survival. U.S. President Donald Trump posted on his social media platform calling for the immediate evacuation of the Iranian capital, saying, "Stay sheltered, don't leave your home, it's very dangerous outside." The messaging was contradictory, and that contradiction mattered. A sitting U.S. president simultaneously calling for people to evacuate and to stay in place reflects precisely the kind of strategic ambiguity that leaves ordinary civilians with no reliable guidance and no clear path forward. It also reveals the gap between military planning and humanitarian consequence, a gap that is now widening with every passing day. Despite the growing exodus, Iranian officials maintained that the situation was under control, offering no clear guidance for the public. That absence of coherent messaging from the Iranian side has accelerated displacement rather than containing it. When people cannot trust the information coming from official channels, they make decisions based on what they can see and hear themselves. And what they were seeing, in the first days of March 2026, was smoke rising from northern Tehran, near state television headquarters and government offices, and the sound of repeated explosions across multiple districts. The internal displacement numbers are now significant enough to demand serious attention. The United Nations Refugee Agency, UNHCR, estimates that 3.2 million people have already been displaced in Iran since U.S. Israeli strikes began on February 28. That figure is striking, not because it represents a cross-border exodus, it largely does not, yet, but because it reflects the sheer scale of internal movement within a country that was already under severe social and economic stress before a single bomb was dropped in this current round of operations. The pattern of that internal movement tells its own story. The International Organization for Migration reported that nearly 22,000 civilian structures have been damaged, including more than 17,000 residential units in Tehran alone, leaving thousands of families displaced. More than 400,000 vehicle entries were recorded in the Caspian Sea provinces in early March, suggesting many residents from heavily impacted cities have relocated to safer northern regions. The Caspian coast has become the de facto refuge of first resort for Tehranis who can move. It offers physical distance from the capital, familiar geography, and the psychological reassurance of open countryside. But it was never designed to absorb a mass migration, and the strain on food, water, and basic services in those northern provinces is already being documented. The strategic logic behind the strikes sheds further light on why displacement is occurring at this pace. The initial stage of the campaign prioritized degrading Iranian air defenses, reportedly striking roughly 200 systems, which enabled the US and Israel to establish effective control of the airspace from western Iran to central Tehran within 24 hours. That kind of air dominance means strikes can reach anywhere in the country with minimal resistance. And when people understand that their capital has no functioning air defense umbrella, the psychological pressure to leave becomes almost impossible to resist, regardless of what any official says. The targeting, according to analysts and military assessments, has extended well beyond purely military infrastructure. Residents in Tehran described blasts across the center, west and south of the capital, while in Isfahan, repeated strikes were reported around army aviation facilities and industrial zones. In Hamadan, reports pointed to strikes near residential townships and a judicial complex, and in Shiraz, local reporting described additional waves of activity. The geographic spread of reported activity across at least 7 major Iranian cities signals a campaign operating at national scale, not confined to a single theater. For ordinary residents, that national scope eliminates the psychological option of simply moving to another major city. There is no obvious safe haven inside the urban network. There is a deeper layer to this displacement that goes beyond the immediate physical reality of the strikes. Even before February 28th, Iran was carrying the weight of compounding crises. Official data showed food inflation rose 41.5% year-on-year in May 2025, with annual inflation hitting 36.3% by August 2025, reflecting a persistent surge that daily market directives had failed to contain. The economic backdrop was already pushing middle-class and professional Iranians toward the exit. The war did not create the impulse to leave, it accelerated and intensified a process already in motion. An immigration police officer at Tehran's Khomeini airport, speaking anonymously, noted that since the 12-day war in June 2025, departures had multiplied, and many who left had not returned after a month or two, a clear sign in the officer's assessment that they had decided not to come back. The officer noted it was no longer just the young leaving, middle-aged and even elderly people were also departing. That demographic broadening is a critical indicator. Early-stage displacement typically involves the mobile and the young. When elderly residents begin calculating whether to leave, you are looking at a population that has genuinely lost confidence in the prospect of a rapid return to normalcy. The situation for Iran's large Afghan population adds yet another dimension of pressure. Before the war, the official number of Afghan refugees and migrants in Iran stood at least 6.1 million people. More than 1.5 million Afghan refugees and migrants were sent back in 2025 alone, according to the IOM, while the Red Cross estimated that more than 1 million more could be sent back by year's end. The war has collapsed the already fragile conditions under which millions of Afghans lived in Iran. Those who cannot leave and cannot return to Afghanistan now exist in a humanitarian limbo that international agencies have described as deeply precarious. They are trapped between an ongoing conflict, a deteriorating economy, and a regime under operational and political pressure that has historically treated Afghan residents as the most expendable population. Now let's consider what this means for Iran's neighbors, because this is where the strategic stakes shift from humanitarian concern to potential regional destabilization. The current cross-border numbers remain, by most measures, surprisingly modest relative to the scale of internal displacement. The UN estimates that only about 1,300 Iranians have crossed into Turkey each day since the war started, and on some days, more people return to Iran than depart. That figure has led some observers to characterize the cross-border situation as contained. That assessment, while technically accurate for now, misreads where the trajectory is pointing. The restraint in cross-border movement reflects specific constraints, not genuine stability. IOM Chief of Mission Salvador Gutierrez noted that movement out of Iran appears limited mainly because people are prioritizing staying with their families, as well as concerns about safety of property, and due to security conditions and logistical constraints. In other words, the barriers keeping people inside Iran are not security or confidence in the situation, they are financial limitations, family ties, and the physical difficulty of moving through a country experiencing active operational pressure. Those are not durable constraints. As the conflict extends, as economic reserves are exhausted, and as infrastructure continues to deteriorate, each of those barriers weakens. The single most important variable in any projection of cross-border movement is infrastructure. Analysts have been direct about the threshold that would trigger mass movement. If Tehran, a city of 10 million people, doesn't have water, they're going to go somewhere, said Alex Vatanka, a fellow at the Middle East Institute in Washington. That statement reflects a principle that humanitarian planners and strategic analysts apply universally. Infrastructure degradation does not produce gradual, manageable displacement. It produces sudden mass movement driven by the collapse of basic urban services. The Caspian provinces and the border crossings with Turkey and Iraq would face that surge simultaneously, with minimal warning and minimal capacity to respond. This is the scenario that Turkey has been preparing for. and the details of Ankara's contingency planning reveal just how seriously Turkish officials assess the potential scale of what could unfold. Turkish Interior Minister Mustafa Çiftçi outlined a three-tier response framework. The first priority is preventing an uncontrolled influx by addressing movement before it reaches the border. The second plan focuses on controlling movement at the frontier through buffer zones. And the third plan would allow entry into Turkey under controlled conditions as a last resort. Turkey has prepared initial capacity to host up to 90,000 people in the first stage of a sudden inflow, including tent camps and temporary accommodation sites. The sequencing of that framework is telling. A capacity of 90,000 is not a number that reflects confidence in Turkey's ability to absorb a significant refugee wave. It is a number that reflects Ankara's absolute intention to keep numbers as low as possible for as long as possible. The buffer zone concept, in particular, has significant political and operational implications. Turkey's foreign ministry briefed parliament that Ankara is preparing for several potential scenarios regarding Iran, with officials expressing a willingness to go beyond usual measures, stating that everything possible should be done on the Iranian side to ensure that those who might arrive remain there. The border infrastructure already being deployed reinforces that posture. Turkey's defense ministry stated that it had hardened its border with Iran by adding 380 kilometers of concrete walls, 203 optical towers, and 43 observation posts. That is not emergency construction. That is a long-term physical architecture designed to give Turkish border forces the capability to monitor and control movement at scale. It reflects a decision made well before the current conflict reached its present intensity, a decision that the Syrian refugee experience, which saw Turkey absorb millions of displaced Syrians during the civil war, would not be repeated. The political pressure inside Turkey on this question is acute. Opposition figures and ultra-nationalist politicians have warned openly that Turkey cannot absorb another refugee wave. Ümit Özdağ, leader of the Victory Party, stated that Turkey is in no position to accept more people, calling on the military to establish a buffer zone inside Iranian territory and arguing that any humanitarian response should be organized inside Iran rather than across the Turkish border. That political sentiment is not a fringe position. It reflects the dominant public mood in a country that has spent over a decade managing the social, economic, and political costs of hosting the world's largest refugee population. Turkey already hosts approximately 3 million Syrian refugees, and officials fear that a conflict in Iran would push not only Iranians, but also hundreds of thousands of Afghan and Pakistani nationals currently residing in Iran toward the Turkish frontier. That secondary displacement layer is consistently underemphasized in public discussion of the Iran crisis. The conversation tends to focus on Iranian nationals crossing the border, but Iran was home to millions of Afghan nationals before the conflict began. A significant portion of that population has already been displaced internally within Iran. If they attempt to cross into Turkey, a country that has been aggressively reducing its refugee population, the operational and political consequences for Ankara become far more complex than a simple Iran refugee scenario. Beyond migration, analysts have warned that internal destabilization in Iran could also reshape the security landscape along the border and could pave the way for armed groups hostile to Turkey to expand their activities. One analyst argued that the most dangerous scenario for Turkey would not be rivalry with a functioning Iranian state, but a fragmented or militarized Iran in which state authority erodes, drawing comparisons to Iraq and Syria, where prolonged instability transformed border areas into arenas for proxy competition and non-state actors. This is the deeper strategic calculation that Ankara is running simultaneously alongside its migration planning. A buffer zone is not just a refugee management tool. In Turkey's strategic calculus, it is also a security perimeter against the kind of border instability that has historically been far more damaging and durable than any temporary refugee influx. The broader regional picture complicates the humanitarian calculus further. The European Union's Agency for Asylum warned that the displacement of just 10% of Iran's population could generate refugee movements of an unprecedented magnitude, potentially rivaling the largest refugee flows of recent decades. That threshold has not been reached in terms of cross-border movement. But the internal displacement figure of 3.2 million already represents roughly 4% of Iran's population. The EU's threshold for historic-scale displacement is not as far away as the current cross-border numbers might suggest, and the EU's own contingency planning reflects awareness of how quickly that gap could close. The UNHCR has warned that large-scale and hurried refugee returns particularly of the Afghan population currently inside Iran, could trigger further instability in the region. Analysts have also noted that destabilization of the Iranian economy hits Afghanistan through two simultaneous channels: reduced trade flows and refugee return surges. Afghanistan, already under severe economic stress, is being positioned as the pressure release valve for Iran's displaced Afghan population, a role that Afghan institutions and infrastructure cannot realistically sustain without triggering cascading instability of their own. What makes the current moment analytically significant is the specific threshold it represents. The displacement pattern today is still primarily internal. The cross-border numbers are still manageable, if tightly constrained. Turkey's buffer zone plans remain contingency architecture, not operational reality. The humanitarian crisis is serious, but not yet in the category that redraws regional political maps. The question that analysts are asking, and that the data does not yet fully answer, is whether the factors maintaining that relative containment are structural, or whether they are simply running out of time. Reports from inside Tehran describe residents engaging in anti-security force chants at night, even as the regime expands patrols, motorcycle units, and stop-and-search points across the capital, with arrests widening across multiple provinces on accusations of sending information on military locations to foreign media. That pattern reflects an authority under pressure, attempting to maintain control over both physical movement and information. The communication clampdown, combined with near-total shutdown of international internet connectivity, is simultaneously making it harder for residents to assess the real security situation and harder for international agencies to track and respond to humanitarian needs in real time. The signals to watch in the coming days are specific and consequential. Any confirmed damage to Tehran's water or power grid would immediately accelerate internal displacement toward the northern provinces and simultaneously intensify pressure at the Turkish and Iraqi border crossings in ways that current contingency plans may not be able to absorb. Turkey's decision on whether to activate the first tier of its border response framework, measures to address movement before it reaches Turkish territory, would signal Ankara's assessment that cross-border pressure has reached an operational threshold. The rate of daily crossings at the Cappadocia border gate in Van province is a concrete observable metric. If that number rises from roughly 1,300 per day toward the tens of thousands, the current phase of the crisis ends and a new one begins. The UN's ability to establish and maintain humanitarian access corridors inside Iran remains critical. IOM chief Amy Pope has noted that one of the key concerns is that some borders are being closed to Iranians who are fleeing, and that such constrictions make the risk to human life significantly higher. Closed borders do not stop displacement. They redirect it through more dangerous routes, increase vulnerability for those in transit, and create pressure that eventually finds the weakest point in any containment architecture. The core strategic reality of this moment is that the displacement crisis and the military campaign are not parallel stories. They are the same story operating on different timescales. The military campaign is producing observable, daily outcomes in the form of strikes, degraded capabilities, and shifting operational control. The displacement crisis is accumulating pressure more slowly, building toward thresholds that are difficult to predict precisely, but are not difficult to identify in principle. 3 weeks into a conflict of this scale and complexity, the humanitarian dimension has not yet overtaken the military one, but the conditions under which it could do so are present, documented, and measurable. Every additional day of active operations without a ceasefire, a political resolution, or a significant humanitarian access agreement narrows the margin between the current situation and a displacement scenario that regional governments, international agencies, and European capitals have been quietly preparing for and hoping they never have to actually manage. This report is based on observable developments and strategic analysis, with some details still evolving as events continue to unfold.